Today we are delighted to have a special guest, Dr. Dave Myers, a professor of psychology at Hope College, join us today. Dave is one of my esteemed colleagues in the Department of Psychology. I'm grateful to have known him for as long as I've been at Hope. And today we're going to talk with Dave about his career as a researcher and as a writer and as a communicator of psychological science to the general public. So Dave, first of all, thanks for joining us on our podcast today.
Thank you, Daryl. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Dave, maybe a good place to start would be if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit about your story, a little bit about how you got into textbook writing, and a little bit about the history of how you found yourself where you are today.
Sure. And it's a story of surprises, and it's like many other people's lives, unpredictable things happening. So I grew up in Seattle in a small business family. I was a licensed insurance salesperson in the family business at age 16, never sold a policy, but that was my first career option. Then I went off to college and decided I would be a doctor. So I majored in chemistry, minored in biology, worked 3 summers in the county hospital in Seattle, half completed my applications to med school, took the MCATs, but I never mailed those applications in because after 3 years, I decided I wanted to be a professor. But I needed something to profess that wasn't chemistry. And I thought back to the one psych class I had had in my first year of college and how much I enjoyed it. And almost on a lark, took several more psych classes in my senior year. And on the strength of my science background, got into graduate school, said I was interested in personality. And when I got to the University of Iowa, I was told, sorry, Dave, the person we have in personality just left, so we've moved you into social psychology. So that's the story of how I became a social psychologist, and in hindsight, that was providential. And then unexpectedly, I got interested in a particular research puzzle, happened to be group polarization, and I got in on the ground floor of that. We can talk a little bit more about that later if you want. And that led to that went well, and it led to invitations to participate in a research conference on group behavior in West Germany, funded by their National Science Foundation with 7 other Americans and 16 Europeans. And there I had the good fortune of being seated near 2 other kind of great heroes of the discipline, Irving Janis of groupthink fame, who was very kind to me afterwards, and Ivan Steiner of the University of Massachusetts. And Ivan was in the January, about 8 months, 7 months after that German experience, was invited by McGraw-Hill to participate in writing a social psych text. He said, no thanks, but you should call this guy David Myers that they'd never heard about at Hope College. So in January of 1979, my phone rang, and thus began a conversation that led to the conversation that we're having today. So sometimes people ask me, how can I get this gig? And I say, I don't know, just do your work and sit in your office and wait for the phone to ring. But it was a whole series of kind of unexpected turns. At each point, I couldn't have anticipated what was five years down the road, but it led to a whole new career on, in writing and communicating of psychological science.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Dave? It sounds like you were very open to kind of whatever came. Like you were willing to like say yes to different opportunities, even if it was something kind of a little bit afield of what you thought in your mind you kind of were going toward. Can you say a little bit more about that? I think some of us get like stuck, like this is what I'm doing, and maybe we're not as open to different opportunities.
Sure. So when I was in graduate school, my sole purpose was to become a teaching psychologist at a teaching institution. And I just unexpectedly got interested in this particular research puzzle. And that led to, okay, so I applied for some research grants, and then I got the research grants. And that led to, one thing built upon another. And then doing the research led to invitations to do various sorts of writing, not just the textbook writing. But did I seize it immediately when that phone rang on that January day, 1979? Yeah, I'd love to do that. Absolutely not. It took 6 months of conversation for me to be persuaded to finally attempt it. And I did so only thinking in the end, what have I got to lose? Well, I've got to lose some pride if the book falls flat and nobody adopts the book and people ask, hey, Dave, how's your book doing? And I have to say, well, nobody liked it. But that was the worst case scenario. The next, even in that case, I would learn a lot about my teaching field because I'd have to survey it more broadly, and I'd be a better teacher and a more informed social psychologist. And the upside is, in fact, what happened. And so, but there was a lot of agony in saying yes to these opportunities because they were kind of career shifting.
Now, Dave, you're in several editions, dozens of editions, or more than a dozen editions in your intro psych textbook and getting close with your social psych textbook. Can you share a little bit about how you organize writing a textbook or how you would organize a large project like a trade book, especially for people who are more accustomed to organizing their time around a discrete project like a journal article or a thesis or a dissertation?
Sure, Darren. I'd say there's kind of two aspects to preparing to write. One is preparing to be a writer. And so I did not see myself as a great writer when given invitations to write. So I set about doing several things. I started reading great writing, uh, science writing, Carl Sagan and others, Lewis Thomas, uh, and just generally good writing. I mean, from children's books to C.S. Lewis books of nonfiction. Second thing is I put my at the beginning I put my writing through a computer grammar checker and had it flag every instance of passive voice, which is sometimes appropriate, but usually active voice is stronger writing, and I developed good radar for passive voice.
Mm.
Uh, then I read a whole series of manuals that guide good writing. Strunk and White Elements of Style would have been the first. Uh, Steven Pinker's writing manual is the most recent I've read.
Mhm.
The most important thing I did, however, is I hired a writing coach, a colleague named Jack Riddle, who is an award-winning teacher and poet here at Hope College, and he became my mentor. And he read and critiqued 5,000 manuscript pages over a number of years. So I was sort of his student in expository writing and then advanced expository writing and so forth. And so he guided me towards ordering words uh, in a way that's pleasing and putting the meaning at the end of the sentence or the beginning, creating a certain cadence, understanding what my own voice was and embracing that. And so that was the first thing to do was just I mean, I think a lot of people jump into writing for the general public without really developing themselves as writers, and we're all vulnerable to the Dunning-Kruger effect when it comes to our own confidence in writing. Uh, so I'm not saying I'm the greatest writer, but I'm simply saying, having gone through that process, I have a skill level that's above what it was when I started. Then the second
Mhm.
thing is just organizing the information, and so if it's a general interest trade book, my process has been to just I start collecting information on a particular topic that's interesting, and it makes it to a certain point where that file is getting pretty thick, and there's enough there to maybe make a book. And with textbooks, it's a matter of I mean the what you're going to write about is sort of preordained by the marketplace, by what teachers expect. And so I have beside me here a system of cubby holes, each corresponding to a chapter. And over the course of the 3 year life of an edition, there's into the thousands of items that entered, 2 or 3 thousand items that entered that cubby hole. And then I pull the materials out, work through them, and see what what makes it into the book. And to make it into the book, there's into one of these texts, it has to first of all be something that we think an educated person needs to know. It's not just important for the discipline, but really people would benefit from knowing about this. And secondly, we have to have a place where to hang it within the structure of our book, or else we have to create a whole new branch on which to hang this. And uh, uh, anyway, so those are some of the hurdles. I was gonna say something else, but it slips my mind right now. Uh, uh, so anyway, kind of two things. One, developing oneself as a writer, and then gathering information. And for me, by the way, gathering information has meant subscribing to like 4 dozen different science and psychological science periodicals, reading tables of contents of other journals, and just availing myself of all the information I can gather.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I actually, this was one of the questions that I really wanted to hear your perspective on, because the first time that I wrote like a book length project, I experienced that as much more challenging to kind of even understand how I was going to organize the research process and kind of how to think about. I mean, part of what I would be wanting to try to do is synthesize more than a typical journal linked article. And so I experienced that as actually very challenging to kind of figure out even just my system, and do I want to do it electronically, and how to think about that. So, um, any additional kind of insights that you had just in terms of what it was like over your career to kind of refine your system of organizing research? And I guess kind of within that question, you talked to this a little bit, but I mean, what would you say to people who want to be writers, just in terms of like what your habits of reading are and how that fits into how you organize for a book? Because I think all three of us are wanting to write more books and kind of align our reading habits with our process of research, and then kind of have that fit into our writing process in a way that's fairly integrated. And so anything you could share with us about what it was like to kind of get better at writing books that were kind of more synthetic in nature? Yeah.
Sure, Donnie. First, I'd say the great pleasure of my work, and it's part of the challenge of communicating psychological science to the public, is that I'm constantly reading, and thus the great pleasure is being able to learn something new every day.
Yeah.
And now I have a blog, talkpsych.com, where I can, along the way, every couple of weeks, write an essay on something that has caught my attention and that I'm excited about. I'd say a second thing is that one question that my friend, the writer Mary Pfeiffer, wrote the bestseller Reviving Ophelia, for example, and some other books, has said, is what you need to write about is what you find yourself talking about. Are you passionate about something? What is it that you tend to rant about? You tend to tell your spouse or partner or best friend about? This is so cool. You got to know this. That's where your passion lies, and that's where you're going to do your best writing. I'd say the third thing, and I now remember, it's the other hurdle that anything has to clear before making it into one of our books, is it has to be something that I can communicate to my audience in a way that they could understand and remember. Some things are important for the discipline, but if I try to teach you I don't know, the details of signal detection theory, for example, the ROC curves, the chances that my readers, for the audience that I have, are going to understand this and then remember it and be able to voice it 3 weeks later are very slim. So that's much less likely to get reported on than something that A, relates to their life, but also is something that I can communicate in a way that they can get their minds around and that will stick to the roof of their minds like peanut butter once they've read it.
Yeah, Dave. To follow up on that, it sounds like there are a few qualities of research that makes it. You said one is that it's simple, it can be communicated, it applies to their life. Any other things? If listeners are thinking about how do I develop a research program that would be high impact, or maybe high visibility, what are some characteristics of research that you see as being high impact?
Yeah. Before I go, let me just say one other thing in response to Donnie's question. Um, and about writing. My first textbook editor, when I turned in my first chapter, gave me this advice, which I've always remembered ever since. Just remember, Dave, for every abstract point, there must be a concrete example. That's something, by the way, Strunk and White emphasize in Elements of Style, is people remember the concrete and the specific. So don't just tell them some abstract or general concept. That's fine, but you need either a real life example or a vividly described experiment. And I try to take people into the experiment. If you're a participant in Milgram's obedience experiment, this is what you would experience. And I kind of let you live it in your own mind, and that helps make it concrete and specific. So, to the question of what's a high impact research, I have no privileged answer to that, but I would say what helped me in my profession is I was able to live out something that Bob Sternberg has recommended to young professionals, and that is buy undervalued intellectual stocks. It was my good fortune to have gotten into the group polarization research before it even had a name, when there was almost no research done, and then to stay with that for a decade. I was not the smartest kid on the block. I'm not a brilliant theorist, and there's other people way smarter than I am. But I was able, because I focused on this one area of research, to make some empirical contributions to it, and to, I think, know the literature as at one point in time, as well as anybody in the world knew it, and to write some review articles for Psych Bulletin and the Advances in Experimental Social Psychology. And and so I think I was able to do more with what abilities I have than people who kind of jump from topic to topic, or sort of dilettantes, if you will. They, and I saw this happen in the group polarization literature. People came in and dabbled and did a study or two and then went on to the next topic. I don't think they ever made the contributions of the people that got in early and stayed with it. And so that would be one suggestion, is to pick up on Bob Sternberg's uh, uh, recommendation to identify, if you can, undervalued intellectual stocks. By the way, I would also say, to be high impact, it somehow it has to connect to full-blooded life. So there's a lot of things that are studied that are forever obscure. I remember a famous, now deceased social psychologist once sending me a paper because he said he thought I was one of 10 people in the world who would be interested in it. And I looked at the paper, and I'm afraid there was at best only 9 people who were interested in it. uh, so, when I look at, if you think of high impact research programs in my field of social psychology, I think of what David Dunning and Tom Gilovich and others, when they were at Cornell University, some of the phenomena that they were able to explore and turn out. Uh, I mean, everything from the Dunning-Kruger effect to the spotlight effect and so forth. They're all, they live. I mean, those are high impact, simple, dramatic, well done studies, replicated, and they have not just lived on in the discipline, but they've made it into public consciousness. Those are, and they're, for a writer, easy to explain because they're simple to describe, and they connect to life. And I'd say some of the research you guys are doing on positive virtues, hope and forgiveness and gratitude and so forth, also connect to full-blooded human life, and so that's great.
Dave, can I ask a follow-up question? And it relates to kind of what you were saying about, staying in one topic and kind of getting to the bottom of it. And then what you said before about, maybe about the importance of finding something you're passionate about. And this could be just me, but I think sometimes I struggle with, like, I'll be doing work in an area and then kind of get a little bored with it, and then I'll be interested in something else and then want to do some work in that area. So I feel like when I look over my career, I have kind of jumped around a little bit, just because different things pique my interest. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is that just kind of a tension that happens?
Well, there's some people, I must say, Stanley Schachter, Bob Zients come to mind as kind of now deceased, but grand social psychologists that made seminal pioneering contributions to multiple different topics. And they're brilliant enough to do that. But in each case, they didn't just dabble for a year or two. So they moved on. And I would say, after 10 years or so, group polarization had sort of run its course. We kind of had explored every facet of the phenomenon. We had a solid concept that was replicable, that we could describe. And I don't think it would have made any sense to spend 20 years studying that, because 10 years sort of wrapped that baby up. And then I happened to get interested in research on positive well-being and happiness and the things that do and don't predict it. And that led to a book. By the way, that book, you're wondering how books emerge, came from my reporting on that literature for my introductory psychology text. And as I did so, becoming so interested in it and thinking, wow, this stuff is really interesting. People should know about this. And nobody at that point, now there's a lot of books on happiness, but at that point, nobody had really written a trade book on happiness. And so I thought, well, why not? Or another topic came up. I mean, because of my interest and my reading about research for the textbook on sexual orientation and being a person of faith and seeing the faith community having a certain perspective, or certainly the conservative part of the faith community, and having been a supporter of marriage and so forth, and being a writer, I thought, whoa, somebody needs to communicate to that audience our emerging understanding of sexual orientation as a natural, enduring disposition, and of the importance of the need to belong for all people, and to relate that to their own religious views. And so that kind of laid itself upon me. That's something I could do this. So why not do it? And so again, it's you things present themselves and you seize those opportunities. By the way, if I could just give one other example, sometimes for the blog essay, things just kind of pop into my mind, and I don't really create them so much as just I feel like I'm a scribe writing them down. So I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning recently and I had an idea for a blog essay that I came in and wrote down, and was posted before the day was over, and it's had several thousand views. Um, uh, just it just kind of deposits itself on the mind, and so that will happen to you too. So listen to those quiet whispers that appear within your own thinking in the quiet moments of your life.
David, sounds like your priorities have shifted over your career. So, whereas conducting, experimental studies was a central part of your focus early on in your career, shifting more towards popular writing and textbook writing has been more predominant later in your career. Can you talk a little bit about what your priorities and how have your priorities shifted, and what advice you'd give to academics as they're navigating the long arc of an academic career?
Well, my experience is not going to be most people's experiences, and if I lived my life over again, it wouldn't be my experience either, because of the unlikelihood that I would have gotten invited to that conference by Jim Davis of the University of Illinois, and that I would have been seated next to Ivan Steiner, whom I would have gotten to know, and that he would have thought to drop my name in that conversation. I mean, it's the conjunction of several unlikely events that led to a 1 in a million result, which was my getting invited to do this writing. So, uh, yeah. So take me back to your question.
How have your priorities shifted? And
Oh,
as you've
yes.
seen your
Excuse
priorities
me.
shifted over
Yeah.
your arc, what
So,
advice
so
would you
they,
give?
they shifted partly because I had done this research, and it had, in some sense, had come to a conclusion. It had answered the question, it had run its course. Then other opportunities arose, and I seized those. And then I don't want to make myself out as, first of all, as altogether successful, because I've done a lot of things that have failed. I've had a lot of articles rejected. I've submitted many times to the New York Times and have never been published by them. I had one book manuscript that did get published, leveraged by another book, but it set a house record for an agent of 36 rejections. Uh, and they would come in batches of 7. Random House doesn't like it for this reason. Simon Schuster doesn't like your manuscript for this reason. Those are really, I mean, you get them 6 or 7 at a time. And so I've known a lot of rejection, and so some things have been, I don't know, have disappointed me that I thought were great and nobody else is interested in. But then other things like the textbook writing has greatly exceeded my expectations. And when it did, then the time it was demanding needed some adjustments on my end if I were to remember to maintain a quality of life as a father and a husband and a happy functioning person who had enjoyment and recreation and yet was keeping up with my field. So at that point, I cut back to half-time teaching and then ultimately to full-time writing, which I see as teaching, as just teaching to an unseen audience rather than to people I'm looking at. And so those are transitions that were made at different points in time along the way.
Dave, were there any periods kind of in that stretch since you kind of started doing some of the textbook writing and other book writing where you weren't sure about, like, did you kind of have a constant positive motivation and kind of intrinsic motivation, or were there lulls in your motivation at different points in your career? And if so, how did you handle those?
Certainly there was, I was motivated by low self-confidence, I would say, in that when I started writing, let's say an introductory text, everybody else that was authoring leading introductory text, Phil Zimbardo, Ernest Hilgard, and so forth. These are like world famous people at world famous universities. I was just this little guy that nobody knew about at this little college in the Midwest. So, I kind of adopted the attitude that, at least nobody's going to outwork me. And so I think I devoted more energy to developing myself as a writer and maybe, went through more drafts of manuscript and, so forth than I think many people would. I remember getting a phone call once from a well-known psychologist who's still with us today, whom I won't name, who said, "Tell me how I can do that. And here's what I want to do. I want to write a book that will sell as many copies and make as much money with as little effort as possible." And and I thought, I'm not sure that those three things all hang together. Uh, so I mean, I guess I was motivated by self-doubt. And then when my social psych manuscript was put out for review, I was so nervous. In fact, I was so nervous and anxious waiting for the reviews to come in that I had my editor, and this was back when they came not electronically, but physically in the US mail. I had my editor uh, I reached a deal with my editor that if she was sending reviews, she would call and let me know that they were coming. Otherwise, I didn't have to have an anxiety attack as I approached the mailbox each day to see if one was there. And then she sent the manuscript out to review by Edward Jones, who was a rigorous experimental psychologist at Princeton University at that time, had himself written a very high level book. And I said, "Oh no, he's the worst person. I mean, he's going to hate this because it's not his style at all." And when the review came in, it was like 8 pages, single spaced or so. It was very helpful, but it was just extravagantly encouraging and kind. And it was probably the single highest moment. I thought, wow, maybe I can do this after all. And over time, and this would be another kind of bit of advice for young professionals, if you will. One of the things I've learned, and you will learn, is that as you accumulate more and more feedback, its power to inflate or deflate you diminishes because you have a growing mound, if you will, of both criticism and affirmation. And each new word of affirmation doesn't explode your head. It feels good, but you know that not everybody loves what you do. And if somebody is severely critical, that doesn't keep me awake at night because I know that other people appreciate what I do. Whereas when you first get feedback on a submitted journal article or something, it has a way of either making you think that you're God's gift to the profession or that you're in the wrong profession. Don't worry. That will calm down and your skin will thicken and you'll be able to cope with it better as time goes on.
Yeah, Dave, that's good. That's a good reminder. I remember my first ever paper that I submitted. I sent it to PSPB, so a good social psych journal. I was feeling very confident. We had 4 studies that I had called experiments. The editor wrote back, and I opened the decision letter in my email, and it says, I had asked for 2 reviews, but after getting one back and reading it myself, I canceled that second review. And I'm thinking, is it just so overwhelmingly positive? And then he launches into this page-long description of how this research is not up to the standard, how I misuse the word experiment. And then he closes, usually they close with, keep us in mind for future submissions. He closed with, I need you to remember that PSPB is a very high-impact journal, so think carefully before resubmitting again. So
please don't send us your work. By the way, when I have given talks to teachers on professional development, the part that they've appreciated most and spoken to me afterwards with, it makes me feel so much better, you too, is when I've quoted to them the worst teaching evaluations I've ever received and the worst textbook reviews I've ever received. From one that I can remember one that said, this is so bad. I mean, obviously you can't publish this, but it was somebody who offered to step in and author the book in my place. Or another reviewer from a Canadian university, person who's now deceased, saying, I just can't believe that anybody would write grammar this bad. It reads like it's a translation from the German language. I mean, it's just, and it went on and on, paragraph, just, and by the way, I always thank reviewers and find something that I can benefit from it. And I did so with this one, even though it was just utter trashing. In the end, he adopted the book. And I could only imagine that this was a curmudgeon who hated all books and he just hated all the others even more than he hated this one. So anyway, I could tell you a lot of stories too. And there's a little book by little old books now out of print, but you could probably get it on the used book market by John White entitled Rejection. That's the one word titled Rejection. And it's a story after story of great and famous works of literature, science, art, music, and so forth that have faced rejection before being accepted and acclaimed. That doesn't mean being rejected indicates you've done something worthy of acclaim. Sometimes it's worthy of rejection, and we need to remember that too. But the lesson here is, if you really believe in something, don't be deterred by somebody who doesn't share that. And if I could just tell one more story here to that effect, I once submitted an article to Today's Education, which went to 2 million American teachers. It was a critique of the gifted child movement and the labeling and categorization of children. And they rejected it. And then a couple other places rejected it, and then I got Jack Riddle to help me redo it a little bit, and with both our names on it. Now, after it had like 4 rejections, but I noticed Today's Education had a whole new team of editors. So I did something that I've never done before or since, and I don't know if it's kosher, but I submitted the article to them again without telling them that they'd already rejected it. And they not only accepted it, they loved it. They asked me to do more writing for them, and it got reprinted in a number of other education periodicals. And this was a multi-rejection paper. So if you believe in something, if you really think you got something, don't be deterred by criticism. There's enough unreliability to professional reviews that what you get the first time may not be what you get the second time, especially if you can learn something from that first critique. But again, you're not taking dictation from those reviews, and textbook reviews, and my editors and I understand that as authors, we're not just scribes taking dictation from our reviewers. We're having to use our own discernment and judgment. That's what we're paid to do.
Yeah, that's so helpful, I think, to normalize the rejection and criticism that we receive in the field. Because I think, especially for new researchers, it's difficult to kind of.
And there's some people that actually incorporate those into their CVs, and so they list papers and all the rejections that they had, as well as the submission, as well as the publication of a paper. And it's really funny, and so it's really encouraging to see. Most of what we do gets rejected, at least on the first try. So that's okay.
I've seen a recent movement in people providing, their real CV, like their real bio, in contrast to what's been published online.
Precisely, that's exactly what I'm referring to.
Yeah, and they're winding paths of rejection and disillusionment.
Right. That's right. But that's life. And if I sometimes say to my friends here on campus who are head coaches of the various sports, that the difference between them and me is their defeats are all on the scoreboard at the end of the night and publicized in the next morning's papers, whereas only my victories get published. My defeats and rejections are private.
Dave, can I ask a question? This might be a little far afield, but you had mentioned in one of your books, being a person of faith, and I was just curious about. Do you have anything to share about kind of your development as a person of faith and as a psychologist, and whether those identities you experience conflict between those identities, and if so, like how you integrated those?
Right. So I would say, I mean, you can follow up with this, but the short answer is that I see a deep compatibility. I'm a theist, and like any theist, I believe, therefore, two things. One, there is a God, and number two, it's not me. And holding both of those things, I therefore know that some of what I believe is wrong. It's in error, and therefore I need to be open to other kinds of information. And so that that idea is at the heart of the religious tradition that I'm part of that has called itself reformed and ever reforming, because it's rooted in a spirit of humility. It understands that you and I are fallible, and therefore it leads us to be less dogmatic and have a greater spirit of openness and curiosity about exploring the world around us by every available means, including science. And so thus that religious tradition has in fact helped give birth to modern science, particularly in the United Kingdom back in the 17th century. And it infuses the strongest departments at my faith-based institutions here at Hope College are the natural sciences and to some extent the social sciences. Uh, so that that spirit of humility. I'm a trustee of the Templeton Foundation, and its founder's motto, he comes out of this tradition too, was how little we know, how eager to learn. And so it doesn't just allow scientific inquiry, free-spirited, skeptical, rigorous scientific inquiry. It mandates it.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. One of the other questions that we have, and you've talked about this, and I think this is a question that Donnie had, and so I'll try to pitch it. But Donnie, if you want to re-clarify, you've talked about communicating psychological science to a broad audience, and you've been doing that for many years. And so, especially thinking about communicating with this next generation that's grown up on their iPhones. If you were starting your career now, knowing what you know, but also with this current generation, what are some new skills that would be needed by researchers or authors who are trying to communicate to the general public now?
Well, certainly there's some people that have skills at using technology as a way to do research. So I just yesterday, talking about you learn something new every day, saw a new article that's coming out that looked at uh, 15 million smartphones and how distant they were from one another in different places and related that to the spread of the pandemic. And where there's greater social distancing as measured by smartphone technology, there's less COVID-19 in those communities. And I thought that is really cool research. I mean, that's harnessing the available technology. I would say the second thing is um, that technology impacts teaching. So and our the presentation and communication of our material. So right now, my website, davidmyers.org, and my avocational website for my hearing loss advocacy, that's hearingloop.org, they're both being revised and they're now in a draft alternative form that is mobile phone compatible in a way that the old websites weren't. And so we're very mindful of the new technology and the fact that this is the way people are getting information. Of course, the new technology also has social implications. So Jean Twenge, the co-author of my social psych book, has become well known for tracking the well-being of adolescents. We just have brand new data out that teen depression has reached even a higher high in the most recent government data available, particularly among teen girls. Jean sees the one thing that's changed since 2008 when we saw this rapid uptick in teen depression has been the spread of mobile phones and increased adolescent screen time. And people have critiqued her analysis, but Well, what else do you see going on, folks? What are the other options, given the correlational data showing that teens that are spending not just 2 hours a day, but 4 to 6 to 7 hours a day on screen are at greater risk for depression? And so, I mean that's an important area of research for social psychologists.
Well, any other questions, Josh or Donnie, while we have Dave with us about writing well, about communicating psychological science to a broad audience, or the maintaining a trajectory over one's arc of their career?
Yeah. I mean, Daryl, I had one question. It kind of picks up on a similar theme, but Dave, you mentioned some of the polarization research, and we're here on election day. I'm curious what and I guess I'm kind of combining Josh's question about, kind of faith in science and some of those aspects. So, um, has your view of kind of your role as a psychologist changed over the kind of last 15 years or so in terms of the political polarization that has happened and kind of how social media is related to that? Like, what would you say to psychologists who are kind of doing work to try to kind of build bridges between different communities and some of those aspects?
That's a great question, Donnie. Um, when I cut my eye teeth on group polarization research, which was finding that when people group with like-minded others and discuss a topic of interest to them, they tend to amplify their shared attitudes. And so if you put high prejudice, people with high prejudice and low prejudice people tend to find themselves with low prejudice people over time as they engage in within group conversation. The gap between them tends to grow. That's group polarization. I never imagined when doing that research how social media would amplify that. I mean, that's really kind of group polarization on steroids because it allows people writ large to find other excuse me, other people of like mind. And the instead of having three major television networks which give us all the same news, now we can each find our own cable network which feeds our thinking as well. And thus this has greatly amplified tribalism in the United States and political division. Ezra Klein has a wonderful book. He's a journalist, but it's great social psychology, Why We're Polarized. Eli Finkel of Northwestern University and an interdisciplinary team of colleagues in the new issue of Science that's just out has also has an article on how social media are driving the tribal politics and polarization of today. I'd say it is one of the the climate apocalypse that's coming is the greatest problem facing humanity. The second greatest problem to me is not the pandemic. That will be over at some point, but it's exactly what you're asking about. And it's a very fertile field, it seems to me, for that is the growing tribalization and polarization of people and ideological segregation of people fueled by and aided by social media on top of our natural tendency to seek out those who think like we do. That's one of the greatest challenges facing humanity, second only to climate change, I think.
Can I ask a follow up question to that? And I'm really interested in this topic too, like how we can, and part of it's my interest in humility and intellectual humility, like how can we get people to kind of understand one another better? But I almost there's a part of me that feels like it's a losing battle a little bit because I think people feel good when they're part of a group that kind of validates their beliefs. And so it's almost like kind of self-reinforcing to be in a group that all kind of thinks like you. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like how we can make it good for people or beneficial for people to get in environments where they're with people who are different?
So empathize with what you're saying because I talk about yet this, and yet I'm an illustration of it. I too seek out websites, cable news talk shows and so forth that feed me what I like to hear, but I also think happen to be the truth. Uh, so that's the kind of the first point. Second point is I think you mentioned intellectual humility, and I've shared with my friends at the Templeton Foundation, where I'm a trustee for at least another half year, that I think their initiative on intellectual humility is one of the most important things they're doing. And in view of what we're talking about, one of the most important things they could be doing in the years to come. How do we teach intellectual humility, a willingness to think critically, to appreciate science, to approach the world and others with a humble spirit? And then that leads to, well, practically, how can you do this? Well, there are some efforts like braverangels.org, which is an effort to get reds and blues to come together to identify the points of fundamental values agreement they have and their points of disagreement, not to have them at the end of a weekend to walk out the door and all thinking alike, no, but to appreciating the humanity of the other person and to understanding how they think. And there are some other efforts that are trying to encourage this. And it seems to me for college and university campuses and even high schools, this could be an agenda item for education in the future. But practical ideas are welcome and needed, and it seems to me that should be a priority for funding by major foundations, given our current tribalism.
Well, you've given us some ideas for our research program and for our writing.
Well, good. And the three of you, you're very creative people. I know I follow work by each of you. See it in the journals to which I subscribe. I have Journal of Positive Psychology on the shelf behind me, for example, and your work is well represented there and other places. And of course, here at Hope College, we're incredibly proud of Daryl as well. But I won't make his head explode.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks.
We criticize him enough to balance it out, so it's okay.
We make sure those scales are even. Well, Dave, we really do thank you for taking the time to come chat with us today, to share about your own story, about some tips for up-and-coming researchers and developing academics. We're grateful for who you are, for your support. And thank you again.
Thank you, Daryl and Donna and Josh. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave.